Many arguments against the aftermath of the flood account pose supposed problems with food supply. For example, skeptics often say that the meat-eating dinosaurs and other carnivores released from the ark would have soon eaten up the other limited amount of animals available, leading to the extinction of all of them in short order. But this falsely assumes that 1. The only sources of meat available to the ark-released carnivores were the other animals that disembarked. 2. There were only the same number of creatures that got off the ark that went on board. And 3. All the animals were released at the same time. Firstly, although there are no real specifics as to which creatures were released in what order, or exactly how long it took until the very last animals exited, logic dictates that simply opening every pen door and sitting back and watching utter mayhem ensue likely wasn't the way the animals' release would have taken place. And the Bible gives us a definite clue that wasn't the case as well. Every beast, every creeping thing, and every bird, everything that moves on the earth went out by families from the ark. Genesis 8, verse 19. That detail given, that they went out by families, lends credence to the idea that there would have been planning involved as to what animals would be let loose first. And more importantly, that there were offspring produced by some animals during the voyage. And of course, over the course of a year, many animals were also likely pregnant and ready to give birth around the time they left the ark. And that means it may have taken several weeks or even a month between when the first creature left and the last animal disembarked, Noah's newly grounded zoo. Also, it makes sense that larger animals, like the dinosaurs, may have been placed on the lowest decks so they would have felt less movement, had less risk of falling and injuring themselves, also acting as ballast. And if the creatures were let loose in a general order of those on the highest to the lowest deck, there may have been several weeks head start of certain creatures over others. During this time, these later disembarking creatures would have simply continued to stay in their enclosures and eat the food stores provided to them, the same as they would have been eating over the last year. Meanwhile, those already released out into the post-flood environment would have had to fend for themselves with what was available in this new world. And what would have that been like? Well, considering the billions of creatures we see entombed in the rock layers worldwide because of Noah's flood, imagine the greater number of creatures that would have simply been caught up in the torrent of water, that were not buried and simply drowned. The post-flood world would have had plenty of rotting corpses of various animals that were not buried in flood sediments, and experience has shown that most carnivores prefer to eat carrion than to kill live animals for food. Also, when you picture the waters receding towards the end of the flood, you can imagine that there must have been many residual pools of water containing marine life left behind afterwards. And as these waters retreated or dried up, fish and other marine animals would be left stranded and available for consumption. These alternative food sources would have diverted the attention of predators for a considerable period of time after the flood. And this would have allowed animal populations to build up to an appreciable size before they became the target of predators. Also, as we discussed in the last episode, many creatures that are considered strictly carnivorous today, such as crocodiles and lions, have been shown to not only have the ability to eat plants, but in some cases seek it out. So what about the plants? Critics often ask how creatures could survive without them, imagining Noah and his passengers stepping out onto a mud ball devoid of any plant life whatsoever. Well, according to the biblical timeline, they wouldn't have had to. The flood event took place over the course of just over a year, and the Bible gives exact details as to when certain events occurred within it. It began on the 600th year of Noah's life and lasted 370 days after, 371 if you count the first and last day as full days. And it was 150 days after the flood started that the ark was grounded somewhere on the mountains of Ararat. However, we're not given the exact altitude on which it did so. So from that point on, vegetation could have started to regrow on whatever land was exposed as the waters began to recede. That means plant regrowth immediately around where the ark landed started at least 7 months before the first animals other than the birds were released. To keep this in perspective, although various grass seed germinates at different rates depending on various factors, it typically occurs between 5 and 10 days. Once germinated, grass usually grows at a rate of about 2 to 3 centimeters per week, which means even at a slower rate, after only 6 weeks, it's almost 12 centimeters or almost 5 inches tall. Vegetables like cucumbers, beans, carrots, and corn take around 2 or 3 months to bear fruit, while potatoes may take 3 or 4. Other underground plants such as turnips and radishes can be ready to eat in as little as a month, while veggies like pumpkins, peppers, cauliflower, and eggplants can take up to about 5 months to mature. Trees, of course, take longer, and their growth rates vary widely. However, some fast-growing types, such as the Thuja green giant, is an evergreen that can reach 15 to 20 feet after only 3 years and stands up to 40 feet tall when mature. Such very adaptable, resilient, disease and insect-resistant types were likely what began providing more stabilizing ecosystems immediately after the flood. Now, the first record of plant life returning is, of course, the olive leaf that was brought back by the dove in Genesis 8, verses 10 to 11. This happened at approximately day 278 of the flood event, a full 128 days after the ark came to rest on one of the mountains of Ararat. Olive trees are one of the hardiest of plants that can regenerate from almost any fragment. It's well known that if pieces of olive branches are buried in the soil, they sprout shoots very rapidly and, like many other plants, reproduce by asexual budding. So this was ample time for the olive to be producing new leaves from regenerated pieces. However, not all plants grow from cuttings. Most grow from seeds. So how could seeds have possibly lasted floating around in the ocean for the duration of the flood? Surprising to some, the very father of today's story of evolution, Charles Darwin, and modern scientists such as George F. Howe, a PhD in botany, have performed experiments to determine whether seeds could survive being soaked in salt water, and how they could be transported over long distances by water. And their conclusions, far from helping debunk the Genesis account, actually provide great insight into how some plants and seeds could have survived during the flood. For example, Howe discovered that even after 140 days of soaking, the seeds of wild-flowering plant types were still viable enough to germinate. Many seeds have an inbuilt mechanism that allows them to become dormant when saturated and then germinate when they dry out. Darwin also made the observation, the carcasses of birds, when floating on the sea, sometimes escape being immediately devoured, and many kinds of seeds in the crops of floating birds long retained their vitality. Some taken out of the crop of a pigeon, which had floated on artificial seawater for 30 days, to my surprise, nearly all germinated. Like Darwin's discoveries, many of the carcasses that died in the flood could have floated as carrion on the surface of the waters, holding and protecting seeds in their bodies. And many plants and seeds could have survived on vegetation mats of floating debris as well. This same floating vegetation may have contained many uprooted trees and other plants that could have survived and then regrown once the flood waters receded. So some seeds could have survived in root systems just as Charles Darwin observed. Out of one small portion of the earth, thus completely enclosed in by the roots of an oak tree about 50 years ago, 3 dicotyledonous plants germinated. Of course, an obvious way that plants would have survived is that they were taken onto the ark as food for Noah, his family, and the animals. And these were replanted by Noah and his family after the flood. After all, we're told Noah specifically planted a vineyard after the flood in Genesis 9:20. As well, after leaving the ark, any of the seeds the animals ingested during their final days on the ark could have passed through them and then been left on the ground in the animals' excrement and germinated soon after. We should also remember there are tree and plant species that actually thrive in flood-like conditions. For example, mangroves, which live primarily along tropical coastlines, along with many flowering plants and trees that flourish in swamplands, such as white cedar, eastern hemlock, black spruce, red maple, elm, pin oak, and birch. Knowing that some trees withstand saturating water conditions makes it difficult to say plants could not have survived the flood, because those trees literally thrive in those conditions. The big picture is that the skeptics claim that plants couldn't have survived the flood and/or there wouldn't have been anything for the animals to eat after the flood is totally unwarranted based on what science has demonstrated. Ironically, by making this claim, they'd have to discount studies done by Darwin and many other evolution-believing scientists. There would have been a bunch of greenery available to creatures as they stepped off the ark, even enough for the dinosaurs that would eventually grow to immense sizes afterwards and spread out all over the earth. Interestingly, the creature called the behemoth, described in Job 40, fits the description of one of these creatures quite well. It was massive, fed on grass like an ox, and had a tail like a huge cedar tree. And it was observed by Job after the flood, not before. Which leads to even more questions asked about what happened after Noah's Ark landed, such as where and how did the dinosaurs and other animals travel all around the world? And if dinosaurs got off the ark, why don't we see them today? Join us next time for the conclusion of our series, where we'll answer, where did the dinosaurs go after exiting the ark? In part 7 of Dealing with Dinosaurs on Noah's Ark.